Sometimes the ground beneath our feet holds more secrets than we ever imagined. Sometimes the very place we call home has been keeping the most important story of our lives hidden from us all along. Nadine Washington spent years feeling like her story was over, her husband gone, her sons grown and moved away, her days filled with quiet routines at the library and long evenings in an empty farmhouse. But when a small tremor cracked the Kansas earth behind her home, it revealed something that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. Buried beneath the soil was a door that had been sealed for over a century. Inside lay artifacts, journals, and evidence of ancestors who had lived, loved, and fought in ways she never knew. What could her great-grandparents have hidden so carefully beneath this Kansas farm? And why did they go to such great lengths to keep their secrets buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of Nadine Washington's kitchen window, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor she'd walked across for 23 years. At 52, she had grown accustomed to the silence that filled the old farmhouse, a silence that once bustled with the voices of her husband, Robert, and their two boys, Jerome and Antoine. Now it held only the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of settling wood that reminded her the house, like herself, was showing its age. She moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find comfort in predictability. Coffee first, 2 spoonfuls of grounds, no more. No less than toast with the strawberry preserves she'd canned last summer from the patch behind the barn. Robert had planted those strawberry runners the spring before his heart attack, telling her they'd have fresh jam for years to come. He'd been right about that, at least at the kitchen table, scarred from years of homework sessions and family meals. Now accommodated only her place setting and the stack of library books she brought home to repair. Working part-time at the Millbrook County Library wasn't much, but it kept her busy 3 days a week and provided just enough income to supplement Robert's modest life insurance and her own small Social Security checks. The work suited her, quiet, methodical, surrounded by stories that belonged to other people. Stories with clear beginnings, middles, and endings, unlike her own life, which seemed to have stalled somewhere in an endless middle chapter. The farmhouse itself had been in Robert's family for 4 generations, passed down through a line of men who'd worked the same 160 acres of Kansas prairie with varying degrees of success. The land was good for wheat and corn, but never quite good enough to make anyone wealthy. It was sustenance land that provided enough to live on if you didn't expect too much from life. Robert had been content with that arrangement, and Nadine had learned to be as well. Now, with property taxes rising and maintenance costs mounting, she often wondered how much longer she could afford to keep the place. Jerome, her older son, was a software engineer in Denver, married with 2 young daughters she saw twice a year if she was lucky. Antoine, 26 and an art teacher in Kansas City, visited more often but was still finding his footing in life, still figuring out who he was meant to become. Neither boy had shown any interest in farming, and she couldn't blame them. The land that had supported their great-great-grandfather barely supported her. The commute to the library took her through the heart of Millbrook, population 1,847, where she'd lived her entire life except for 2 years of community college in Topeka. Main Street looked much the same as it had when she was a girl. Hartwell's General Store, Murphy's Diner, the First Baptist Church where she still attended Sunday services, and the library housed in a converted Victorian mansion that some long-dead cattle baron had built for his bride. The brass nameplate on her desk read, Mrs. Nadine Washington, library assistant, though everyone in town simply called her Nadine or, occasionally, Robert Washington's widow, as if her identity remained forever tethered to a man who'd been gone 3 years now. Her supervisor, Mrs. Helen Curtis, was a kind woman in her 70s who'd run the library for 30 years with the gentle authority of someone who truly believed books could solve most of the world's problems. Helen had given Nadine the job when she desperately needed both purpose and income, and for that, Nadine would always be grateful. The work was soothing cataloging new arrivals, mending torn pages, helping the occasional patron find exactly the right story for their particular moment in life. "You've got a gift for matching people with books," Helen often told her. "It's like you can sense what someone needs before they know it themselves." Nadine had never thought of it as a gift. Exactly. It seemed more like survival, the same instinct that had helped her navigate 25 years of marriage, motherhood, and the particular challenges of being one of only 3 black families in Millbrook. She'd learned to read people, to anticipate needs, to make herself quietly indispensable. It was a skill that had served her well, even if it had also taught her to make herself smaller, to take up less space than she might have otherwise claimed. The afternoon brought her usual tasks, processing returns, updating the card catalog system that Helen stubbornly refused to computerize, and helping old Mr. Patterson find large print mysteries for his wife's failing eyesight. The rhythm of library work had become as familiar as breathing, and she moved through it with half her attention, while the other half wandered to more pressing concerns. The roof needed repairs before winter. The furnace made concerning noises. The truck Robert had bought used in 2018 was showing signs that it might not survive another Kansas winter. Small problems, all of them manageable individually, but collectively, they represented a weight that grew heavier each month. She'd considered selling the farm. Jerome had suggested it more than once, but the thought of leaving felt like betraying not just Robert's memory, but some deeper connection she couldn't quite name. That evening, after a dinner of leftover soup and cornbread, she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic to search for the flashlight she kept for emergencies. The power had flickered earlier during a brief afternoon storm, and she wanted to make sure she could find it if needed. The attic smelled of dust and old wood, filled with boxes and furniture that had accumulated over decades of family life. Down in the corner, beneath a tattered quilt that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, she found a small wooden chest she didn't remember seeing before. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a family Bible with a cracked leather binding and pages soft with age. The inscription on the first page, written in faded brown ink, read, "Property of the Washington family, 1847. Below that, in different handwriting, "May this record guide our children home." The Bible contained the usual family records, births, deaths, marriages, but also pressed flowers between certain pages and small notations in the margins that seemed to have nothing to do with Scripture. One page had a pressed violet next to a verse about hiding treasures in darkness. Another showed a small sketch of what looked like a star next to a passage about following lights in the wilderness. She settled into Robert's old recliner with the Bible in her lap, studying the mysterious notations by lamplight. Her family history had always been somewhat sketchy stories passed down through generations with the vague quality of legend rather than fact. Her father had died when she was 12, and her mother, who'd moved to Topeka to be closer to her sister, had passed 5 years ago without sharing much about the family's deeper past. What she knew was simple. The Washingtons had farmed this land since just after the Civil War. They'd been poor, but respectable, church-going people who'd worked hard and minded their own business. Robert's great-great-grandfather had supposedly bought the land from a white farmer who'd given up on Kansas and moved back east, though the exact details of that transaction had always been vague. Now, holding this Bible with its strange markings and pressed flowers, she wondered what stories had been lost along the way. The notations felt deliberate, like a code or message meant for family members who would understand their significance. But understand what? And why hide messages in a Bible, of all places? Outside, the Kansas wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of rain across the prairie. Nadine closed the Bible carefully and returned it to the chest. But her mind remained active, with questions that circle around something just beyond her understanding. As she prepared for bed, she found herself looking out her bedroom window toward the backyard, where Robert had always planned to plant a vegetable garden, but never quite found the time. The land stretched away into darkness, holding whatever secrets it had kept for more than a century and a half. She fell asleep that night with the strange feeling that something was waiting for her, something that had been patient for decades but wouldn't wait much longer. The feeling stayed with her through dreams filled with unfamiliar voices calling her name and the sound of footsteps on wooden floors that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the earth. When she woke the next morning, the sky was clear, but she could feel something different in the air, a subtle shift that suggested change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The tremor came at 5:47 in the morning, gentle enough that most people in Millbrook slept right through it. Nadine felt it as a subtle swaying that pulled her from the edges of sleep, nothing dramatic. Just the house settling in a way that seemed different from its usual creaks and sighs. She might have dismissed it entirely if not for the coffee mug that slid 3 inches across her nightstand, leaving a wet ring on the wood. Kansas wasn't earthquake country. In 52 years of living on the same patch of prairie, she'd never felt the earth move beneath her feet. But there it was, a gentle rolling motion that lasted maybe 10 seconds and left her sitting up in bed, listening to the silence that followed. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to check for damage, though she wasn't sure what earthquake damage was supposed to look like. The morning air carried the clean smell of rain-washed earth from the previous evening's storm, and everything appeared normal. The barn standing straight, the fence post still plumb, the old oak tree by the house showing no signs of stress. It wasn't until she walked around to the back of the house, toward the area where Robert had always meant to plant that vegetable garden, that she saw it. Where there had been level ground the day before, a depression now marked the earth, roughly circular, about 6 feet across, and deep enough that she could see it wasn't just settled dirt. Something underneath had given way. Kneeling at the edge of the depression, she brushed away loose soil with her hands. Her fingers found wood-weathered planks that felt solid despite their age. As she cleared more dirt, the outline became unmistakable. A door set into what appeared to be a wooden frame, buried perhaps 2 feet beneath the surface of her backyard. Her first instinct was to call Jerome. Her practical son would know what to do, would research property records and contact the appropriate authorities. But something held her back, perhaps the memory of the strange Bible with its coded messages, or simply the growing certainty that this discovery was meant for her alone. At least initially. She spent the morning clearing dirt from around the door, working with the careful patience she'd learned from years of mending damaged books. The wood was oak, she thought, darkened with age but remarkably well preserved. Iron hinges showed spots of rust but remained intact. Most intriguingly, the door had no visible handle or latch, just a small keyhole set into the wood near what would have been eye level for someone standing on the buried steps she was beginning to uncover. By noon, she'd revealed a set of stone steps leading down to the door, and the magnitude of what she'd found began to settle in. This wasn't some storm cellar or root cellar she'd forgotten about. The construction looked older than the house, possibly older than any structure she knew of in the area. Someone had built this deliberately, carefully, and then buried it so completely that it had remained hidden for decades. The keyhole drew her attention repeatedly. It was larger than modern locks, with decorative metalwork around the edges that suggested craftsmanship from an earlier era. She'd seen similar work in the antique shops in Topeka 19th century pieces that spoke of a time when even utilitarian objects were made with care and artistry. That afternoon, instead of going to the library, she called in sick and began searching the house for anything that might fit that lock. She started with the obvious places: kitchen drawers, Robert's toolbox, the miscellaneous containers in the basement were odd bits of hardware, accumulated over the years. The basement yielded nothing except dust and the reminder that she'd been putting off cleaning it for too long. But in a corner she rarely explored, behind an old dresser that had belonged to Robert's parents, she found a small tin box that had apparently been pushed back and forgotten years ago. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was an iron key unlike any she'd ever seen. The key was larger than modern house keys, with an ornate head decorated with symbols that looked almost like stars or flowers. The metal was black with age, but solid, and when she held it up to the light, she could see tiny marks etched into the surface marks that looked deliberately made rather than random. Where? Her hand shook slightly as she carried the key back to the buried door. The fit was perfect, so perfect that she knew this wasn't coincidence. The key turned smoothly despite its age, and she heard the distinct click of a lock mechanism that had waited decades to be opened again. Door swung inward on hinges that moved with surprising ease, revealing not the root cellar or storm shelter she'd half expected, but stone steps leading down into darkness. Cool air drifted up from below, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something that reminded her of church sanctuaries and libraries. The smell of important things carefully preserved. She stood at the threshold for a long time, flashlight in hand, trying to process what she was seeing. The steps were cut stone, fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of serious construction. The walls visible in her flashlight beam were stone as well, and she could see that the passage continued beyond the reach of her light. This wasn't just a hiding place. This was architecture, purposeful, expensive, built to last. But built for what? And by whom? The rational part of her mind suggested calling the sheriff, or at least Jerome. This kind of discovery might have legal implications. There could be safety concerns. For all she knew, the structure might be unstable after all these years underground. But as she stood there with the key heavy in her palm and the cool air rising from below, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity mixed with the kind of excitement she'd thought was lost to her. Whatever lay beneath her backyard, it was connected to her family, to this land, to a story she'd never been told. The phone call from Jerome came as she was still debating her next move. "Hey, Mom. How you doing?" "I'm fine, honey. Just fine." "You sure? You sound different. Just tired." It's been a long day. The lie came easily, which surprised her. She wasn't typically secretive with her sons, but something about this discovery felt too fragile to share just yet. "Listen, I've been thinking about Christmas. Michelle and I were talking about bringing the girls to see you this year instead of you coming here. Would that work? We could stay a few days, help you with any projects around the house." Christmas was still 3 months away, but Jerome was a planner. "That would be wonderful. You know I love having you here." "Good. Antoine said he'd drive over from Kansas City too, so we'll have the whole family together. It'll be like old times." After he hung up, Nadine looked back at the open door. Like old times. But what if the old times she thought she knew were just the surface of something much deeper? What if her family's real story had been waiting all this time, buried beneath 2 feet of Kansas soil, locked away until the earth itself decided it was time for the truth to come to light? She made her decision. Tomorrow she would descend those stone steps and see what her ancestors had hidden so carefully beneath the prairie. Tonight, she would gather proper lighting, tell the library she needed a few personal days, and try to ready herself for whatever revelations waited in the darkness below as sunset painted the Kansas sky in shades of gold and pink. She replaced the wooden planks over the door opening and scattered loose dirt across them. From a distance, the depression looked like nothing more than settled earth, unremarkable, easily overlooked. But she would not overlook it. Not anymore. Tomorrow, she would step into the hidden history that had been waiting beneath her feet her entire life. Asterisk. The next morning, armed with her largest flashlight, a battery-powered lantern, and a thermos of coffee, Nadine made her second approach to the hidden door. The early October air held a crisp promise of autumn, and mist rose from the dew-soaked prairie grass as she carefully removed the planks and dirt she'd used to conceal her discovery. The key turned as smoothly as it had the day before, and this time she didn't hesitate at the threshold. The stone steps were solid beneath her feet, worn smooth by age and use but structurally sound. 15 steps down, the passage leveled off into what appeared to be a chamber carved from the limestone that lay beneath much of this part of Kansas. Her lantern revealed a space larger than she'd expected, roughly 20 feet square, with a cross ceiling high enough that she could stand comfortably. The walls were lined with wooden shelving, and the floor was made of the same fitted stone as the steps. But what struck her most was how preserved everything appeared. The air was dry, and whatever had been stored here had been protected from moisture and decay. The shelves held an assortment of items that seemed to span decades. Wooden boxes of various sizes, rolled papers tied with string, jars and bottles with handwritten labels, pieces of clothing wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth. In one corner stood a small table with 2 chairs, and against the far wall, a narrow bed with a straw mattress and folded quilts. This wasn't just storage. People had lived here, however, temporarily. She began her exploration methodically, starting with a wooden crate that sat on the table. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, she found a collection of items that seemed to have been selected with great care. A silver locket containing a photograph of a young woman she didn't recognize, a set of baby clothes sewn from fine cotton, a small wooden cross, and beneath everything else, a hand-drawn map. The map was unlike anything she'd seen in local historical displays. Drawn on heavy paper with what appeared to be homemade ink, it showed the area around Millbrook with far more detail than any official survey. Property lines were marked, but so were things that wouldn't appear on a legal document. Wells, hidden paths, even what looked like underground passages connecting various farms in the area. Her own property, though it wasn't marked as the Washington place, appeared to be at the center of a network of these underground connections. Lines drawn in red ink connected her location to at least 5 other farms, creating what looked like a web across the county. In the margin, someone had written in careful script, "Safe passage for the children of God." The implications began to settle in like pieces of a puzzle she'd been missing most of her life. The Underground Railroad. She'd learned about it in school, of course, but always as something that happened elsewhere. Pennsylvania, Ohio, places with larger populations of abolitionists and established networks. Not here in Kansas, where the history she'd been taught focused on farming and cattle drives and the occasional tornado, but the evidence was right in front of her. The chamber, the map, the careful preservation of supplies, it all pointed to her family's land being part of something much larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. On the shelf closest to the bed, she found a collection of items that seemed more personal. A worn Bible, several books including what appeared to be a primer for teaching reading, and a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to L. Washington in various hands, some barely literate, others showing educated penmanship. L. Washington. She searched her memory for family names and came up with Lavinia Roberts' great-great-grandmother. The woman family stories said had been strong-minded and ahead of her time. She died in 1890, according to the family Bible. But beyond that, Nadine knew almost nothing about her. She opened the first letter carefully, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was uncertain, as if the writer was still learning. "Dear Sister Lavinia, we made it safe to Lawrence, and the people there were good to us, like you said they would be. Thomas learned his letters already, and Mary is getting better with her cough. We will not forget what you've done for us, and maybe someday we can help somebody else the same way. Your friend always, Ruth, Sister Lavinia." The term of address suggested more than casual friendship. It spoke of shared purpose, shared risk, shared commitment to something larger than individual survival. The second letter was more formal, written in educated script on better paper. Mrs. Washington, the package you sent arrived safely and in good condition. The contents were exactly as described and met our needs perfectly. We anticipate requiring similar assistance in the coming weeks and trust we can rely on your continued cooperation. Your discretion in this matter continues to be appreciated. Respectfully, J.M. Package. Contents. The coded language was clear enough when viewed in context. People weren't packages, but in correspondence that might be intercepted. Euphemisms provided protection for everyone involved. She spent the rest of the morning reading through the letters, piecing together fragments of a story that revealed her great-grandmother as a central figure in something that must have required enormous courage. The letters spanned several years in the 1850s and early 1860s, and they painted a picture of regular traffic through the underground chamber families. Individuals, sometimes groups as large as 8 or 10 people, all moving north toward freedom. By afternoon, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was uncovering. This wasn't just family history. This was American history, preserved in a limestone chamber beneath her backyard. The responsibility of that discovery weighed heavily on her shoulders. She decided to drive to the library, not to work, but to research. Helen Curtis looked surprised to see her. "I thought you were taking a sick day, dear." "I'm feeling better. I just need to look up some things about local history." The library's local history section was small but comprehensive, maintained by a dedicated volunteer who'd spent years collecting newspaper clippings, photographs, and documents related to Millbrook and the surrounding county. Nadine had helped organize these materials, but had never paid much attention to the antebellum period. Now she searched specifically for references to the Underground Railroad, to families named Washington, to anything that might provide context for what she'd found. The results were frustratingly sparse. A few mentions of suspicious activity in sheriff's reports from the 1850s, references to abolitionist sympathizers in editorial columns, but nothing concrete, nothing that mentioned specific names or locations. It was as if that entire chapter of local history had been deliberately obscured, written out of the official record. But why? And by whom? As she drove home that evening, Nadine realized she was looking at her neighbors differently. The Miller's farm to the north, the old Peterson place to the east. Had they been part of the network shown on Lavinia's map? Were there other chambers, other secrets, other families who'd participated in this dangerous work? And if so, what had happened to change everything so completely that even the memory of it had been erased? Asterisk. The following days fell into a pattern that felt both thrilling and exhausting. Nadine would complete her morning routine, drive to the library for her scheduled shifts, and return home each afternoon to continue her exploration of the underground chamber. She told Helen she was working on a home improvement project that required her attention, which was true enough. Though not in any way Helen might imagine, each visit to the chamber revealed new layers of complexity. What she'd initially taken for a single room proved to be a network of connected spaces, some carved directly from the limestone, others constructed with careful stonework that spoke of significant investment in time and resources. The largest chamber contained a bed and personal items, but 2 smaller rooms branched off from it, one clearly designed for storage, the other set up as what could only be described as a classroom. In the classroom space, she found a collection of slate boards, chalk, and books that had been carefully preserved in wooden boxes lined with wax cloth. The books included basic primers, advanced readers, and several volumes that surprised her. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and a collection of speeches by William Lloyd Garrison. These weren't the kind of books that would have been commonly found in rural Kansas homes in the 1850s. They represented a deliberate commitment to education and, more dangerously, to the abolitionist cause. the storage room yielded the most emotionally powerful discoveries. Here she found items that had clearly belonged to the people who'd passed through. Children's shoes worn thin from walking, a baby's rattle carved from wood, letters never sent because the writers didn't know where their separated family members had gone. Each item represented a life interrupted, a family torn apart, a desperate hope for something better. But it was in this same storage room that she made the discovery that would reshape her understanding of everything she'd found so far. In a wooden chest pushed far into a corner, beneath layers of blankets and clothing, she found a collection of documents that took her breath away. The papers were legal documents, bills of sale, property transfers, and most significantly, manumission papers, freedom papers. But these weren't just historical curiosities. They were blanks, unfilled forms ready to be completed with names and details. Someone had acquired official documents and was using them to create new identities for people who'd escaped slavery. More shocking still, many of the completed forms bore the signature of Nadine Washington as a witness, and several showed her as the purchaser in what were clearly fictional sales, designed to establish legal freedom for people who'd taken it for themselves. The dates on the documents ranged from 1854 to 1863, suggesting that the operation had continued throughout the most dangerous years of the slavery period and into the Civil War. Nadine Washington hadn't just been providing shelter and food to escaping slaves, she'd been creating new identities for them, helping them establish legal existences as free people. The scope and sophistication of the operation was staggering, and the legal risks she'd taken were enormous. In the 1850s, such activities would have been federal crimes punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. That evening, Nadine called Jerome, needing to share at least part of her discovery with someone she trusted. "Mom, you sound excited about something. I've been researching our family history, and I've found some interesting things about your great-great-grandmother. Lavinia, I thought nobody knew much about her. Well, it turns out she was more remarkable than anyone realized. I'm finding evidence that she was involved in helping escaped slaves during the Civil War era." Jerome's silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. "Finally, are you serious? Our family was part of the Underground Railroad? It's looking that way? I'm still piecing things together, but the evidence is pretty compelling." "Mom, that's incredible. Have you talked to any historians about this? This could be really significant." "Not yet. I'm still trying to understand it all myself. You should document everything carefully. Take photographs, make notes. This isn't just family history. This is American history." After the call, Nadine sat in Robert's recliner with a legal pad, trying to organize what she'd learned into something coherent. The timeline alone was remarkable. Lavinia had apparently begun her activities in the mid-1850s, continued them through the most dangerous period of the slavery debate, and kept working even after the Civil War began. The underground chambers had been constructed to support not just temporary shelter, but extended stays and education for people transitioning from slavery to freedom. The questions remained that bothered her. If Lavinia's work had been so extensive and successful, why had the family stories never included any mention of it? Why had such an important legacy been allowed to disappear from family memory? And what had happened to end the operation and bury its history so completely? The next day brought unexpected insight from an unlikely source. Mrs. Catherine Burke, her elderly neighbor to the west, stopped by with a basket of late tomatoes from her garden. Catherine was 84 years old and had lived on the adjoining farm her entire life. Her family had been among the original German settlers in the area, and she possessed the kind of long memory that comes from growing up in a place where stories pass from generation to generation. "I heard you've been doing some digging around your place," Catherine said as they sat on Nadine's front porch drinking iced tea. Nadine felt a moment of panic. Had her excavation been visible from Catherine's house? Just some yard work. Catherine nodded knowingly. My grandmother used to tell stories about this area back in the old days. Strange stories about people who traveled at night, families who appeared and disappeared, folks who weren't exactly what they seemed to be. What kind of stories? Oh, you know how old people talk. She said there were houses around here where the cellars went deeper than they should, where you might hear voices underground when there wasn't supposed to be anyone there. She said some of the colored families around here weren't quite what they claimed to be, that they'd come from somewhere else and taken new names. Catherine paused to sip her tea, studying Nadine's face carefully. Of course, Grandma also said those were dangerous times, and people did what they had to do to survive. She always spoke respectfully of your husband's people. Said the Washingtons were good neighbors, even when being good neighbors might have been risky. Risky how? Well, you have to understand, not everyone around here was sympathetic to the abolition cause. There were plenty of folks who thought runaway slaves should be sent back where they came from, and they weren't too particular about how that happened. Grandma said there were some close calls, some visits from authorities, asking questions about unusual activity. Catherine finished her tea and stood to leave. But those are just old stories, of course. Probably half legend by now. Still, if you're doing family research, you might want to be careful about what you dig up. Some secrets were buried for good reasons. As Catherine walked back to her own house, Nadine realized that her neighbor had told her much more than had appeared on the surface. Catherine knew something, or at least suspected something, about the underground chambers. Her visit hadn't been casual. It had been a gentle warning, delivered by someone who understood that some discoveries carried responsibilities as well as revelations. That night, Nadine lay in bed thinking about Catherine's words. Some secrets were buried for good reasons. What had happened to make it dangerous for the Washington family to remember their own heroic history? And why, after all these years, had the Earth chosen now to give up its secrets? Asterisk, a week into her exploration, Nadine discovered the deepest chamber yet, a room that required crawling through a narrow passage that had been cleverly concealed behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall. The entrance was marked only by scratches in the stone that looked like natural wear, but when examined closely, revealed a pattern that suggested human design. This final chamber was smaller than the others, but more carefully appointed. The walls had been plastered and painted white, and the floor was made of wooden planks that had survived remarkably well in the dry conditions underground. Against one wall stood a wooden chest that was clearly different from the others she'd found. Larger, more ornate, with brass fittings that spoke of significant value. The chest was locked, but the same key that had opened the outer door fit perfectly here as well. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk that had preserved them almost perfectly, was a collection of documents. That made her previous discovery seem simple by comparison. The first item was a leather-bound ledger, with Freedom Records written on the cover in Nadine Washington's careful script. The pages contained names, dates, and destinations of people who'd passed through the underground station. But more than that, they contained detailed records of new identities created for each person. The ledger showed that Lavinia had helped more than 200 people establish new lives as legally free citizens between 1854 and 1865. Each entry included the person's original name, their chosen new name, their point of origin, their destination, and most importantly, the documentation created to support their new identity. Many entries included notes about skills, family connections, and plans for their future lives. It was a masterpiece of careful record-keeping, but it was also evidence of activities that would have been considered serious federal crimes. Beneath the ledger, she found a collection of official documents that took her understanding to an entirely new level. These weren't just manumission papers. They were birth certificates, property deeds, marriage licenses, and business documents, all bearing official seals from various states and territories. Someone had been operating a sophisticated document forgery operation alongside the Underground Railroad activities. But the most shocking discovery was a document bearing Lavinia's signature alongside that of a man identified as E. Washington, apparently her husband, whose existence had never been part of the family stories Nadine had grown up hearing. The document was a property deed showing the purchase of additional land adjacent to the original farm. But the date was 1866, after the Civil War had ended. The purchase was described as being made for the purpose of establishing permanent settlement for freedmen and their families. E. Washington, Nadine, had always been told that Lavinia was a widow who'd raised her children alone after her husband died young. And here was evidence of a husband who'd not only survived, but had been an active partner in her Underground Railroad activities and had continued working with her to help former slaves establish new lives, even after the war ended. The implications were staggering. Not only had her family's history been sanitized, but entire people had been written out of it. E. Washington Ezra, according to a marriage certificate she found deeper in the chest, had apparently been deliberately erased from family memory. But why? The answer came in a collection of newspaper clippings from the Millbrook Gazette, carefully preserved despite their age. The headlines told a story that chilled her. Local unrest following emancipation, concerns about freedmen settlements, night riders target Negro sympathizers, Washington property attacked by unknown assailants. The final clipping, dated September 15, 1868, carried the headline, Ezra Washington found dead suspected. Murder remains unsolved. The article described finding his body in a field half a mile from the farmhouse, with evidence suggesting he'd been beaten to death. The sheriff's investigation had concluded that he'd been killed by unknown parties, opposed to his work with freed slaves, but no arrests were ever made. Suddenly, the family stories made terrible sense. Lavinia hadn't been a widow by circumstance. She'd been widowed by violence, targeted because of the work she and her husband had done to help escaped slaves. And afterward, the family had apparently decided that survival meant forgetting. Forgetting the Underground Railroad work, forgetting Ezra entirely, forgetting anything that might make them targets for the kind of hatred that had killed him. Dodd at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of silk that had once been white but had yellowed with age. She found a collection of personal items that brought tears to her eyes. A man's wedding ring, a small photograph of Lavinia and a man who must have been Ezra standing in front of the farmhouse, and a letter addressed to my beloved wife in handwriting that matched some of the earlier documents. The letter was dated 2 days before Ezra's death. My dearest Lavinia, if something should happen to me, I want you to know that I have never regretted the work we have done together. We have helped God's children find freedom, and that is work worth any risk. But I fear the hatred in some men's hearts runs deeper than their respect for law or decency. If the worst should come, please know that you and our children must do whatever is necessary to protect yourselves. The work we have done together will stand as our monument, even if the world chooses to forget it. Hide these records well, for someday our descendants will need to know what we sacrificed for freedom. All my love, Ezra. Nadine sat in the underground chamber, holding her great-great-grandfather's final letter, understanding finally why the family history had been so deliberately obscured. Lavinia had hidden the evidence of their work not out of shame, but out of necessity. In the violent aftermath of Reconstruction, being known as Underground Railroad conductors had made them targets for murder. But Ezra had been right about one thing. Someday, their descendants would need to know. And apparently, that day had come. That evening, she called the Millbrook County Historical Society and spoke with Dr. Margaret Torres, a historian who specialized in Civil War-era Kansas. Without revealing the full extent of her discovery, Nadine asked general questions about Underground Railroad activity in the area. It's one of the gaps in our local history, Dr. Torres admitted. We know there was activity, The geographic location makes it almost certain, but documentation is extremely sparse. Most of the families involved either destroyed their records or never kept them in the first place. It was simply too dangerous. What about after the war? Would people have continued to be at risk? Oh, absolutely. In some ways, the danger increased after emancipation. There were vigilante groups throughout Kansas who targeted anyone they considered Negro sympathizers. Several documented cases of violence, including at least one murder that was never solved. Nadine's breath caught. A murder? Yes, a local farmer named Ezra Washington. Found beaten to death in 1868. The investigation suggested it was racially motivated, but nothing was ever proven. Tragic case, so the historical record did contain some truth, just not the whole truth, and not in a way that connected it to ongoing family legacy. Dr. Torres knew that Ezra Washington had been murdered for his beliefs, but she apparently didn't know that his work had continued through his wife, or that evidence of their activities still existed. After hanging up, Nadine realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could preserve these documents privately, sharing them only with Jerome and Antoine as family heritage. Or she could bring them to light publicly, contributing to the historical record and honoring her ancestors' courage, but also accepting whatever complications that might bring. Ezra's letter had asked for their descendants to know what they'd sacrificed, but it hadn't specified what those descendants should do with that knowledge. As she prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about Catherine Burke's warning. Some secrets were buried for good reasons. But she also thought about the 200 names in Lavinia's ledger, 200 people who'd found freedom because of her family's courage. Maybe it was time for their story to be told. The quote appeared on a Thursday morning in late October, discovered in a cedar chest that Nadine had initially overlooked because it seemed too ordinary to contain anything significant. She'd been systematically cataloging every item in the underground chambers, photographing and documenting each piece as Jerome had suggested. When she noticed that the cedar chest in the main room had a false bottom, the space beneath was lined with more oiled silk and contained what was clearly the most precious item in the entire collection, a quilt unlike any she'd ever seen. At first glance, it appeared to be a traditional star pattern, the kind of geometric design that Kansas farm wives had been making for generations. But as she spread it out on the underground chamber's wooden table, the differences became apparent. The stars weren't randomly placed. They formed a deliberate pattern that corresponded exactly to locations on the hand-drawn map she'd found earlier. Each star was embroidered with tiny symbols. Some looked like arrows, others resembled compass points. Still others appeared to be numbers or letters in a code she didn't recognize. Around the border, worked in thread that was almost the same color as the background fabric, were directions written in the smallest, most careful stitches. Follow the drinking gourd north 2 days to the crossroads. Safe house marked with blue door. Cross water at the old mill. This wasn't just a quilt, it was a navigation system. A map that could be carried, shared, and passed from person to person without looking like anything more than a piece of domestic handiwork. The sophistication of it took her breath away. Someone had created a tool that could guide escaped slaves across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, disguised as something so common that no one would give it a second look. The quality of the workmanship was extraordinary. Every stitch was perfect, every symbol precisely placed. This was the work of someone who understood that lives would depend on accuracy, that a misplaced star or unclear direction could mean the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death. In the corner of the quilt, worked in stitches so small they were barely visible, she found the initials LW and a date, 1858. Lavinia Washington had created this masterpiece at the height of the Underground Railroad's activity, when the Fugitive Slave Act made helping escaped slaves a federal crime punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. But the quilt revealed something else that fundamentally changed Nadine's understanding of her family's role in the Underground Railroad. The locations marked by the stars extended far beyond Kansas, reaching into Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, and all the way to the Canadian border. This wasn't a local operation. It was part of a network that spanned half the continent. She spent the rest of the day studying the quilt, comparing its symbols to the documents and maps she'd already found. The pattern that emerged was of an operation far more complex and far-reaching than she'd imagined. The Washington farm hadn't just been a stop on the Underground Railroad. It had been a central hub, a place where routes converged and diverged, where information was gathered and disseminated across a network of safe houses and conductors. The implications were overwhelming. Lavinia and Ezra Washington hadn't been simple farmers who occasionally helped a desperate family. They'd been key figures in one of the most important resistance movements in American history, managing logistics for an operation that stretched across multiple states and involved hundreds of people. That afternoon brought another revelation. While carefully examining the basement of her house, looking for other connections to the underground chambers, she found evidence of modifications that had never been explained in family stories. What she'd always assumed was simply a root cellar proved to have multiple entrances, including one that connected directly to the tunnel system she'd discovered. Outside, the house itself had been designed as part of the Underground Railroad infrastructure. The basement could conceal large numbers of people, with ventilation systems that would allow them to remain hidden for extended periods. The main floor had sightlines that would allow lookouts to watch all approaches to the property. Even the location of the house on a slight rise made sense. It provided strategic advantages for an operation that needed to see danger coming and respond quickly. Everything she'd taken for granted about her childhood home took on new meaning. The root cellar where she'd played as a child had sheltered freedom seekers. The basement where Robert had stored his tools had hidden families fleeing slavery. The very floorboards she walked on had been carefully designed to muffle sounds from below. That evening, she called Antoine, needing to share her discoveries with someone who might understand their emotional impact. "Mom, this is incredible," he said after she described the quilt and its implications. "Do you realize what you found? This isn't just family history. This is a piece of American art history. Quilts like this are in museums. I keep thinking about the courage it must have taken," she said, "not just to help people, but to do it on this scale for so many years, and to do it knowing that if they were caught, they could face federal charges. Mom, our ancestors were heroes. Real heroes, but nobody remembered. How do you just forget something like this?" Maybe they didn't forget. Maybe they chose not to remember. After what happened to Ezra, maybe forgetting was the only way to stay safe. After the call, Nadine returned to the underground chambers with new purpose. If her family had deliberately forgotten their own heroism for safety, then maybe it was time to remember it for inspiration. The world needed to know that ordinary people, farmers, housewives, working families had risked everything to fight injustice. But as she sat in the main chamber, surrounded by evidence of her ancestors' courage, she also felt the weight of responsibility. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were sacred objects, created and preserved by people who'd sacrificed everything for the cause of freedom. Whatever she decided to do with them needed to honor that sacrifice. She opened Lavinia's ledger again, reading through the names and stories of the people who'd found freedom through her family's work. Sarah, age 23, traveling with 2 small children to relatives in Chicago. James, a skilled carpenter looking to start his own business in Detroit. Mary and Thomas, elderly couple seeking to find family members who'd escaped years earlier. Each entry represented a life transformed, a family reunited, a dream of freedom realized. Her ancestors had made that possible, one person at a time, one family at a time, despite the enormous risks to themselves. The question that kept her awake that night was simple. but profound. What would Lavinia and Ezra want her to do with their legacy? Keep it hidden and safe, or share it with the world and risk whatever consequences might come? In her dreams, she walked through the underground chambers and found them filled with voices, men, women, children speaking softly of journeys completed and new lives begun. They didn't seem like ghosts so much as witnesses waiting patiently for their stories to be told. The discovery that would change everything came in the most unexpected place, not in the underground chambers where she'd been finding treasure after treasure, but in her own bedroom, in a trunk that had belonged to Robert's grandmother and had sat unopened in the corner for as long as she could remember. She decided to search every inch of the house for additional clues, working methodically through rooms and storage spaces she'd taken for granted for decades. The trunk had always been there, covered with an old quilt and serving as a makeshift table for the lamp by her bedroom window. She'd assumed it contained nothing more than old linens or out-of-season clothes. When she finally opened it, she found layers of carefully folded fabric that did indeed appear to be old quilts and clothing. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of canvas and tied with twine, was a package that felt different from everything else. Inside was a Confederate soldier's uniform, complete with brass buttons and insignia, along with a military discharge certificate and a medal for valor. The name on the discharge papers stopped her cold. Private Ezra Washington, 1st Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. The uniform was Confederate gray, but the discharge papers clearly indicated Union service. The contradiction made no sense until she looked more carefully at the documents and found a letter folded between them. Written in Ezra's familiar handwriting, "My beloved Lavinia, I must tell you what I have never told anyone else about my service in the war. The uniform I have kept is not from my own regiment, but from a Confederate soldier I killed at the Battle of Honey Springs in July 1863. I took his clothes and papers because our mission required that I be able to pass for a Confederate when necessary. This is the burden I carry, not just that I took a man's life, but that I used his identity to save others." The letter went on to explain that Ezra had been part of a special intelligence unit within the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, men who used their ability to pass through Confederate lines to gather information and assist in prisoner rescues. The Confederate uniform had been his disguise, allowing him to move freely through enemy territory and help Union soldiers escape from Confederate prison camps. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Attached to the letter was a detailed report, written in official military language, describing Ezra's most significant mission: the liberation of a Confederate prison camp in Arkansas where more than 200 Union soldiers, both white and black, were being held in conditions so brutal that few were expected to survive. Ezra's report described how he'd used his Confederate disguise to infiltrate the camp, identify escape routes, and coordinate with local Underground Railroad conductors, including his own wife, to move the escaped prisoners to safety. The operation had been successful, but it had also made Ezra a marked man. Confederate authorities had eventually identified him as the infiltrator responsible for the prison break, putting a bounty on his head that would follow him for the rest of his short life. The murder that the local newspaper had attributed to racial hatred now took on a different dimension. Ezra hadn't been killed simply because he'd helped escape slaves. He'd been killed because he was a wanted Confederate fugitive who'd humiliated their military and cost them valuable prisoners. But there was more. Among the military documents, she found correspondence between Ezra and his commanding officers that revealed the full scope of his work. He hadn't just been a soldier, he'd been a spy, an intelligence operative who'd spent months behind enemy lines gathering information that had contributed to several Union victories. One letter from his commanding officer, dated just weeks before his death, commended him for extraordinary service beyond the call of duty and recommended him for promotion and a medal for distinguished service. But the letter also contained a warning. Private Washington's activities have made him a high-value target for Confederate agents who remain active even after the war's end. We strongly recommend that he and his family take appropriate precautions for their safety. Apparently, those precautions hadn't been sufficient. The final document in the package was the most personal and the most heartbreaking a letter from Lavinia to the military authorities, written after Ezra's death. Gentlemen, I am writing to inform you of the death of my husband, Private Ezra Washington, who was murdered on September 13, 1868, by persons unknown. I believe his death is connected to his military service and the bounty placed on his head by Confederate sympathizers. I am taking steps to protect our children and preserve the evidence of his service. But I fear that his sacrifice will be forgotten if I do not take action now to ensure that his story survives. He died as he lived fighting for freedom and justice for all people. The letter was never sent. It was marked draft in Lavinia's handwriting, and attached to it was a note. Too dangerous to send. Must protect the children. E's story will have to wait for safer times. Nadine sat on her bedroom floor surrounded by the evidence of her great-great-grandfather's heroism, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Ezra Washington hadn't just been an Underground Railroad conductor. He'd been a war hero, a spy, a man who'd risked everything repeatedly in service of freedom and justice. And his wife had been not just his partner in Underground Railroad work, but his intelligence contact, his source of local information, his anchor to home during dangerous missions behind enemy lines. The family stories had gotten everything wrong. Lavinia hadn't been a widow who'd struggled alone after her husband's early death. She'd been the widow of a war hero who'd been assassinated for his service to his country. The Underground Railroad work hadn't been a simple matter of conscience. It had been part of a sophisticated military intelligence operation that had contributed to Union victory in the Civil War. And all of it had been forgotten, buried beneath layers of protective silence that had lasted for more than 150 years. She called Jerome immediately, despite the late hour. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "Jerome, I found something else. Something that changes everything I thought I knew about our family." "What is it?" "Your great-great-grandfather wasn't just an Underground Railroad conductor. He was a Union spy, a war hero. He was murdered by Confederate agents after the war because of missions he'd carried out during the fighting." The silence stretched so long that she thought the call had dropped. Finally, Jerome's voice came back, barely above a whisper. "Are you sure? I have his military records, his uniform, letters describing his missions." "Jerome, our ancestor was a hero in ways we never imagined. Mom, you have to preserve all of this. You have to get it to historians, to the military archives. This isn't just our family history. This is American history that's been lost." After the call, Nadine sat in the quiet house, thinking about the weight of hidden history. Two people who should have been remembered as heroes had been deliberately forgotten for the safety of their descendants. Their courage had been buried along with their story, their sacrifice obscured by the need to protect their children from the hatred that had killed their father. But now their great-great-granddaughter had uncovered the truth. The question was, what was she going to do with it? Outside, the Kansas wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse, and somewhere in that wind, she thought she could hear voices calling her name, voices that had waited more than a century for their story to be told. Asterisk. November arrived with the first serious cold snap, and with it came a discovery that would prove to be the most significant of all. While searching the deepest recesses of the underground chamber system, following passages that seemed to extend further than she'd initially realized, Nadine found a sealed room that appeared to have been walled up deliberately sometime after the others were completed. Breaking through the limestone barrier required tools she didn't own and strength she wasn't sure she possessed, but something about the careful way the wall had been constructed suggested that whatever lay behind it was important enough to have been specially protected. She spent 2 days working with a sledgehammer borrowed from Catherine Burke, chipping away mortar and stones until she could squeeze through an opening, barely wide enough for her shoulders. Inside was a time capsule, not the kind of informal collection of artifacts she'd been finding, but a deliberate, carefully planned repository of items specifically intended for future discovery. The room contained a single wooden table on which sat a metal box with a letter taped to the top, addressed in careful script, "To our descendants, when the time is right." The letter was dated 1923 and signed by Nadine Washington, daughter of Lavinia and Ezra. Nadine recognized the name. From family stories, Hattie had been the family matriarch, who'd lived into the 1940s, and had been known for her strong opinions and fierce independence. "To those who find this box," the letter began, "I pray that you are living in a time when the truth can finally be told without fear. I am the daughter of Lavinia and Ezra Washington, and I have spent my life guarding secrets that should have made them heroes, but instead made our family targets for hatred and violence." Hattie's letter went on to describe events that had occurred after Ezra's murder, events that had never been included in any family stories Nadine had heard. The assassination hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a systematic campaign by Confederate sympathizers and white supremacist groups to eliminate anyone who had been involved in Underground Railroad activities or who had served in black Union regiments. In the years following Papa's death, Hattie wrote, "We received threats regularly. Our barn was burned twice. Shots were fired at our house. Mama was warned by the sheriff that she should leave the county for her own safety, but she refused to be driven away from land that Papa had died to defend." The campaign of intimidation had intensified during the 1920s, coinciding with a resurgence of Ku Klux Klan activity throughout Kansas. 3 families in neighboring counties who had been connected to Underground Railroad activities were forced to flee their homes after night raids and cross burnings. The descendants of several conductors had been beaten, their property destroyed, their livelihoods threatened. It was then that we made the decision to hide the evidence of our family's work. Hattie continued, "Not out of shame, but out of necessity. Mama sealed the underground chambers and swore us all to secrecy. We changed our family stories, made Papa into a simple farmer who had died in an accident, made Mama into a widow who had struggled alone. We buried the truth to save our lives." But Hattie had been unable to bring herself to destroy the evidence entirely. Instead, she had created this time capsule, preserving the most important documents and artifacts in the hope that someday it would be safe for the truth to be told. The metal box contained items that completed the picture Nadine had been piecing together. Official military correspondence confirming Ezra's intelligence work. Photographs of Lavinia with groups of former slaves who had settled in the area after the war. Letters from families across the country thanking the Washingtons for their help. And most importantly, a list of other families throughout Kansas and Missouri who had been part of the same network. Many of the names on the list were familiar families whose descendants still lived in the area. Families whose histories had also been sanitized for protection. The Millers to the north, the Johnsons to the east, the Browns near town all had ancestors who'd been involved in Underground Railroad activities, and all had apparently made the same decision to hide their histories when it became dangerous to remember them. But the time capsule contained something else, something that took Nadine's breath away and changed everything she thought she understood about her responsibilities. It contained detailed instructions for what to do if the chambers were ever discovered. "If you are reading this," Hattie had written, "it means that the earth has given up its secrets and the time for hiding is over. You must understand that you are not just the keeper of our family story, but of a much larger history that has been deliberately erased from official records. The families listed in this box have pieces of the same story, and it is your responsibility to bring them together. The instructions were specific and detailed. Contact information for historical societies, universities, and museums that specialized in Underground Railroad history. Names of researchers who had been looking for exactly the kind of evidence Nadine had found. And most importantly, a network of other families whose descendants needed to be contacted and brought into the story. Our ancestors died to preserve these secrets, Hattie's letter concluded, but they preserved them so that someday they could be shared. The time for secrecy has passed. The time for truth has come. Honor their sacrifice by telling their story. That night, Nadine sat at her kitchen table with Hattie's instructions spread in front of her, making the phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Dr. Margaret Torres at the Historical Society, who listened with growing excitement as Nadine described what she'd found. Mrs. Washington, what you're describing could revolutionize our understanding of Underground Railroad activities in this region. We've been missing pieces of this puzzle for decades. Would you be willing to have the site professionally documented? The second call was to Jerome, who listened in stunned silence as she described the time capsule and Hattie's instructions. Mom, this is bigger than we thought. This isn't just about our family anymore. This is about preserving a piece of American history that was almost lost. Are you ready for that? For everything that might come with it? Jerome's answer came without hesitation. Mom, our ancestors risked their lives to help people find freedom. The least we can do is risk some publicity to make sure their story gets told. The third call was to Antoine, who was driving from Kansas City to spend the weekend helping her process everything she'd found. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon, he said. Mom, I think we need to plan for Christmas to be different this year. Instead of just family gathering to exchange gifts, maybe it should be family gathering to honor our ancestors' legacy. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's time to invite the whole family, not just Jerome and me, but the extended family, the cousins we never see, the relatives who've scattered across the country. If Hattie is right about other families having pieces of this story, maybe Christmas is when we start bringing those pieces together. After the calls, Nadine walked through the house with new eyes, seeing it not just as her home, but as a monument to courage that had been hidden for too long. Every room held evidence of her ancestors' heroism. Every floorboard had supported people fleeing to freedom. Every window had watched for signs of danger and signals of safety. Outside, the November wind carried the promise of winter, but also something else, a sense of anticipation, as if the land itself was preparing for the moment when its secrets would finally be shared with the world. For the first time since Robert's death, Nadine felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. She wasn't just preserving family history, she was preserving American history. She wasn't just honoring her ancestors, she was continuing their work of fighting for justice and truth. The underground chambers that had hidden freedom seekers for more than a decade would soon be filled with historians, archaeologists, and visitors who wanted to understand how ordinary people had accomplished extraordinary things in the service of human freedom. The time for hiding was over. The time for truth had finally come. Christmas. Eve arrived with a heavy snow that blanketed the Kansas prairie in pristine white, transforming the farmhouse into something that looked like it belonged on a holiday card. But the gathering inside was unlike any Christmas the Washington family had ever experienced. Jerome had driven from Denver with Michelle and their two daughters, 8-year-old Destiny and 6-year-old Hope. Antoine had arrived from Kansas City the day before, and together the brothers had helped their mother prepare the house for what they were calling the Great Revelation. The dining room table, extended to its full length, was covered not with holiday dishes, but with carefully arranged documents, photographs, and artifacts from the underground chambers. Nadine had spent weeks preparing for this moment, organizing the evidence in a way that would tell the story chronologically and completely. She'd created a timeline that stretched across one wall, showing the progression from the earliest underground railroad activities through Ezra's military service to the eventual decision to hide their family's heroic history. But the most powerful display was in the living room, where she'd arranged the personal items that brought the story to life. Lavinia's quilts, Ezra's uniform and medals, the family Bible with its pressed flowers and coded messages, and photographs that showed her ancestors not as the simple farmers of family legend, but as central figures in one of America's most important resistance movements. Before we begin, Nadine said as the family gathered around the tree, "I need you all to understand that what I'm about to share with you will change how you think about our family, about this house, and about your own place in American history." Destiny, precocious and curious like her father, raised her hand as if she were in school. "Grandma Nadine, does it have to do with the big hole in the backyard that you covered up with boards?" The adults laughed, but Nadine nodded seriously. "Yes, sweetheart, it has everything to do with that hole. And after we talk about it, we're going to go outside, and I'm going to show you what's down there." She began with the family Bible and its mysterious notations, letting them handle the fragile pages and examine the pressed flowers that had served as markers for important passages. Then she showed them the hand-drawn map with its network of connected safe houses, explaining how their property had been at the center of a sophisticated system for helping escaped slaves find freedom. "Your great-great-great-grandmother, Lavinia, wasn't just a farmer's wife," she said, watching their faces as understanding dawned. "She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She was a hero." Michelle, who worked as a teacher and had always been interested in history, leaned forward to examine the documents more closely. "Nadine, this is incredible. These are primary source documents that historians have been looking for. You're holding pieces of American history that everyone thought were lost." Jerome picked up one of the letters from families who had been helped by Lavinia, reading it aloud. "Dear Sister Lavinia, we made it safe to Canada and our children are in school now, like you said they could be. We named our new baby girl after you because we will never forget what you done for us. This is ... double quotes." He paused, overcome with emotion. "This is our family they're talking about." Antoine had been quietly examining the quilt, tracing the embroidered stars with his finger. As an art teacher, he understood the technical skill required to create such a piece, but more than that, he understood its significance as both functional tool and work of art. "Mom, do you realize what this means? These aren't just family heirlooms. These are artifacts that belong in museums. This quilt alone could teach people things about Underground Railroad, communication that they never knew before." But it was when Nadine brought out Ezra's military records and the Confederate uniform he'd used as a disguise that the full magnitude of their family's courage became clear. "Your great-great-great-grandfather wasn't just a conductor," she said, a voice thick with pride and grief. "He was a Union spy who rescued prisoners of war and gathered intelligence behind enemy lines. He was murdered after the war by Confederate agents who wanted revenge for his military service." The room fell silent as the family absorbed this information. Finally, Hope, the 6-year-old, spoke up. "So our great-great-great-grandparents were like superheroes?" Nadine smiled through her tears. "Yes, honey, they were exactly like superheroes. They fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous. They helped people who needed help even when they could have been killed for it." Jerome stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where the entrance to the underground chambers lay hidden. "Mom, we can't keep this secret anymore. Too many people suffered and died to preserve this history for us to just hold on to it privately." "I know," Nadine said. "That's why I called Dr. Torres. She's coming tomorrow with a team from the university to begin documenting everything properly. And I've been in touch with descendants of some of the other families who were part of the network. Some of them are driving here for New Year's to share what they know. Antoine joined his brother at the window. So this house is going to become famous. This house already is famous, Nadine corrected him. It just took 150 years for anyone to remember why. Asterisk. The moment that would define everything came when they descended into the underground chambers together as a family. Nadine had strung battery-powered lights throughout the passages, illuminating the stone corridors and rooms that had been hidden in darkness for more than a century. 8-year-old Destiny was the first to speak as they reached the main chamber. It's like a secret house under our house. That's exactly what it was, Nadine explained, watching her granddaughter's faces as they took in the preserved furniture. The teaching materials, the evidence of lives lived and saved in these hidden rooms. People stayed here when it wasn't safe for them to be anywhere else. But it was when she opened Lavinia's personal journal and began reading aloud that the full emotional impact of their discovery hit the family. Lavinia's own words, written in her careful script by candlelight in these very chambers, brought the past to vivid life. March 15th, 1859. A family of 5 arrived tonight, traveling with only the clothes on their backs. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 4 years, had never worn shoes. Ezra gave her a pair that belonged to our Hannah when she was small. The child's joy at having shoes that fit her feet nearly broke my heart. How can human beings own other human beings when the evidence of our shared humanity is so clear in a child's smile? Jerome wiped his eyes as his mother continued reading. This isn't just history. Mom, these are real people, real families, real children who found safety here because our ancestors had the courage to help them. The journal entries painted a face to help them. The journal entries painted a story, picture of daily life in the underground chambers. That was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Lavinia wrote about teaching children to read by lamplight, about sharing meals with families who hadn't known kindness in years, about the constant fear that discovery would mean death for everyone involved. April 3rd, 1860. Word came today that slave catchers are working the area, offering rewards for information about suspicious activity. Ezra has hidden the entrance better, and we have prepared the families here to remain silent no matter what they hear above ground. I pray that our neighbors' discretion holds, for all our lives depend on it. But perhaps the most powerful entry was one of the last, written just days before Ezra's murder. September 10th, 1868. Ezra returned today from what he says will be his final mission. The war is over, but the work continues. There are still people who need safe passage, still families separated by violence and hatred. He is tired, and I see the weight of all we have done in his eyes. But when a child thanks him for helping them find their father, or when a woman tells him she can finally sleep without fear, I know that we have chosen the right path, no matter where it leads. Antoine had been quietly examining the teaching materials preserved in the smaller chamber, the slate boards, the primers, the carefully maintained collection of books. They weren't just hiding people, he said, his voice filled with wonder. They were educating them, preparing them for their new lives as free citizens. Michelle, the teacher in the family, understood the significance immediately. In the 1850s, teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most states. It was punishable by fines, imprisonment, even violence. But your ancestors were running a school down here. Nadine nodded, opening one of the primers to show pages where different hands had practiced writing letters and words. I found evidence that some people stayed here for months, not just days. Long enough to learn to read and write, to understand their legal rights as free people, to prepare for lives they'd never been allowed to imagine. The family spent hours in the underground chambers, handling artifacts, reading documents, and gradually understanding the full scope of what Lavinia and Ezra had accomplished. By the time they climbed back up to the house, they were changed people, no longer simply descendants of Kansas farmers. but heirs to a legacy of heroism that had shaped American history. That evening, as they sat around the Christmas tree sharing hot chocolate and trying to process everything they'd learned, Jerome asked the question that would define their path forward. "Mom, what do we do with this responsibility? How do we honor what they did?" Nadine had been thinking about that question for weeks, but tonight the answer came clearly. We tell their story. We share it with the world. We make sure that Lavinia and Ezra and all the people they helped are remembered, not as footnotes in history books, but as the heroes they were, even if it means giving up our privacy. Michelle asked, "Even if it means this place becomes a tourist destination and our quiet family life changes forever?" Nadine looked around at her family, her sons who had driven hundreds of miles to be here, her daughter-in-law who understood the historical significance of what they'd found, her granddaughters who would grow up knowing they were descended from heroes. "Our ancestors gave up much more than privacy to do what was right," she said. "They gave up safety, comfort, anonymity. They risked everything because they believed that human freedom was worth any sacrifice. The least we can do is risk a little inconvenience to make sure their sacrifice is remembered." Hope, the 6-year-old, had been listening quietly to the adult conversation. Now she spoke up with the clarity that sometimes comes from children. "Grandma Nadine, if we don't tell people about the superheroes, then nobody will know that superheroes are real." In that moment, Nadine knew that her decision was made. The time for secrecy was over. The time for truth had finally come. The moment that would define everything came when they descended into the underground chambers together as a family. Nadine had strung battery-powered lights throughout the passages, illuminating the stone corridors and rooms that had been hidden in darkness for more than a century. 8-year-old Destiny was the first to speak as they reached the main chamber. "It's like a secret house under our house." "That's exactly what it was," Nadine explained, watching her granddaughters' faces as they took in the preserved furniture. The teaching materials, the evidence of lives lived and saved in these hidden rooms. People stayed here when it wasn't safe for them to be anywhere else. But it was when she opened Lavinia's personal journal and began reading aloud that the full emotional impact of their discovery hit the family. Lavinia's own words, written in her careful script by candlelight in these very chambers, brought the past to vivid life. March 15th, 1859. A family of 5 arrived tonight, traveling with only the clothes on their backs. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 4 years, had never worn shoes. Ezra gave her a pair that belonged to our Hannah when she was small. The child's joy at having shoes that fit her feet nearly broke my heart. How can human beings own other human beings when the evidence of our shared humanity is so clear in a child's smile? Jerome wiped his eyes as his mother continued reading. "This isn't just history, Mom. These are real people, real families, real children who found safety here because our ancestors had the courage to help them. The journal entries painted a fainted face to help them. The journal entries painted a story, picture of daily life in the underground chambers. That was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Lavinia wrote about teaching children to read by lamplight, about sharing meals with families who hadn't known kindness in years, about the constant fear the discovery would mean death for everyone involved. April 3rd, 1860. Word came today that slave catchers are working the area, offering rewards for information about suspicious activity. Ezra has hidden the entrance better, and we have prepared the families here to remain silent no matter what they hear above ground. I pray that our neighbors' discretion holds, for all our lives depend on it. But perhaps the most powerful entry was one of the last, written just days before Ezra's murder. September 10th, 1868. Ezra returned today from what he says will be his final mission. The war is over, but the work continues. There are still people who need safe passage, still families separated by violence and hatred. He's tired, and I see the weight of all we have done in his eyes. But when a child thanks him for helping them find their father, or when a woman tells him she can finally sleep without fear, I know that we have chosen the right path, no matter where it leads. Antoine had been quietly examining the teaching materials preserved in the smaller chamber, the slate boards, the primers, the carefully maintained collection of books. They weren't just hiding people, he said, his voice filled with wonder. They were educating them, preparing them for their new lives as free citizens. Michel, the teacher in the family, understood the significance immediately. In the 1850s, teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most states. It was punishable by fines, imprisonment, even violence. But your ancestors were running a school down here. Nadine nodded, opening one of the primers to show pages where different hands had practiced writing letters and words. I found evidence that some people stayed here for months, not just days. Long enough to learn to read and write, to understand their legal rights as free people, to prepare for lives they'd never been allowed to imagine. The family spent hours in the underground chambers, handling artifacts, reading documents, and gradually understanding the full scope of what Lavinia and Ezra had accomplished. By the time they climbed back up to the house, they were changed people, no longer simply descendants of Kansas farmers, but heirs to a legacy of heroism that had shaped American history. That evening, as they sat around the Christmas tree sharing hot chocolate and trying to process everything they'd learned, Jerome asked the question that would define their path forward. "Mom, what do we do with this responsibility? How do we honor what they did?" Nadine had been thinking about that question for weeks, but tonight the answer came clearly. We tell their story. We share it with the world. We make sure that Lavinia and Ezra and all the people they helped are remembered not as footnotes in history books, but as the heroes they were, even if it means giving up our privacy. Michelle asked, "Even if it means this place becomes a tourist destination and our quiet family life changes forever?" Nadine looked around at her family, her sons who had driven hundreds of miles to be here, a daughter-in-law who understood the historical significance of what they'd found, her granddaughters who would grow up knowing they were descended from heroes. "Our ancestors gave up much more than privacy to do what was right," she said. "They gave up safety, comfort, anonymity. They risked everything because they believed that human freedom was worth any sacrifice. The least we can do is risk a little inconvenience to make sure their sacrifice is remembered." Hope, the 6-year-old, had been listening quietly to the adult conversation. Now she spoke up with the clarity that sometimes comes from children. "Grandma Nadine, if we don't tell people about the superheroes, then nobody will know that superheroes are real." In that moment, Nadine knew that her decision was made. The time for secrecy was over. The time for truth had finally come.